Okay, we are going to talk about peer feedback in this video tutorial, and this is a very important concept because, as you know, peer feedback can really help faculty out because faculty only have so much time to give feedback, and it also gives peers an opportunity to really increase another skill set, evaluating others. And we learn a lot from our peers. So I think that peer feedback is a way that when you're teaching someone or supporting someone, you learn quite a bit from that process. And then, of course, the person who's receiving the feedback also learns quite a bit from the process as well. So it can be a mutually beneficial activity. And one of the other reasons that peer feedback really works well is that so often in college, students don't always get an opportunity to see what other classmates are doing. So this gives you an opportunity to see the work of peers, and that is another layer of modeling that can really be quite helpful. Now, just because it's a good idea doesn't mean it always works. In fact, sometimes there are very, very huge challenges associated with peer feedback. I'm sure you've all probably engaged in some kind of process, and perhaps you felt, not even able or competent to serve in that role because you yourself were unsure of how to complete the task well. Maybe you didn't have the right amount of background knowledge in order to do it. Maybe the feedback that you either provided or received from a peer was too general. I think that's one of the most common issues with peer feedback is, you might get that, traditional good job, great work here, but nothing specific about exactly what worked well. And many peers are very hesitant to give one another negative feedback. So you might get the good jobs and you might not even get anything in terms of constructive feedback. And if you remember, Latkowski and Ginsberg talk about one of the important characteristics of feedback is that it informs so that you can use it and put it into practice to really improve what you do. And if you don't have any constructive feedback, that's not going to be of any use to you. So as I said before, many peers are just uncomfortable in that role, feeling not qualified to be able to serve as a peer evaluator. And sometimes peers may give wrong, inaccurate feedback to a classmate. So maybe they'll say this isn't the way it's supposed to be, and maybe it was, or maybe they'll say, this is the way a citation is supposed to be, and they're inaccurate in that as well. So I do think that although peer feedback has a great role in the learning process, we have to be very cautious and careful because of the potential pitfalls of peer feedback. When I came across this article by Facey, I was really quite intrigued because, again, I found that there's so many challenges with peer feedback that I was almost ready to kind of abandon ship on that and say, you know what, it may not be worth it. Maybe I should just provide all the feedback myself. But thinking about different ways to make it more effective really is a better approach. And Facey came up with this really great conveyor belt model. So here's how that works. Basically, what Facey talked about is that when you ask students to provide feedback on an entire paper or project, that's too overwhelming. I mean, let's face it, as faculty members, grading the paper is really challenging. Now we're asking a novice, in the field to then take on that really challenging task. And, why would we be surprised if that didn't actually work out well? So instead, what Facey does is Facey talks about dividing folks into different teams or different groups, and then training each group on a very specific type of feedback. So each group has their own lens that they would be looking at the paper or project through, and they would just be providing feedback on that component, on that part of it. So it involves dividing students into groups, training students on that, and then really thinking that it needs to happen during class time so that you can monitor and make sure that it's working out well. Let's take a look at an example. So if you had a paper, for instance, and these are just arbitrary, topics or groups, you can, depending on the nature of the paper or the project, determine whatever type of feedback providers you want. The categories can really vary from place to place. But I did want you to see an example. So maybe you have a group that's going to serve as the citation police. And maybe their only job is to look at each sentence and determine whether it's common knowledge, the author's own idea, or whether it needs a citation. So if after every sentence they're looking at it and they think that, this does not seem like general knowledge to me and it does not seem like the author's idea, then you can just put a C after that sentence to make sure that the your classmate realizes that a citation is needed. So it's kind of a check to make sure no plagiarism, took place and that they're citing appropriately. If you wanted to, you could also make sure that they're doing the citations accurately, and you could give them a model of how in-text citations should look. So those are a couple of different strategies for that team. Then perhaps you have another group of students who are the main idea locators, and what you're asking them to do is maybe either underline the most important point of a paragraph or the thesis statement of each paragraph, and whether or not they're accurate, at least they're getting feedback about what a reader is perceiving to be the most important. And then the last group of example, in this particular example, would be the completeness checker. So, and what this person can do is look at the assignment, what it's asking students to do, and generally there's several bullets or different parts of an assignment, and they would go through to make sure that all of those different parts were included. So if there were a series of questions they were supposed to answer, they would all be answered. Now here's how this works. So let's pretend we have a class of 20 or so students. We divide them up into approximately, each group would have about 7 or so, maybe 8 depending on the size of the class. I like to try to have folks work together in pairs. I find that works well when they're supporting each other in this process. So you'd have them divided, and they'd all have the same assignment that they'd be working on, and then I usually have them come to class with a draft of the assignment with no name attached, so that it's an anonymous exchange. And then you have them exchange papers anonymously. Now you have each team that you've given, it doesn't need to be a long training. It doesn't have to be an hour long or a day long. It can be even 5 or 10 minutes. You go around and you train each group to make sure that they know, or you can even do that prior to class by having them watch an online video or something of that nature, so they all know what their task is. So now what happens is you have paper A in front of you, and paper A is going to be looked at by the citation police first. So the citation police are going through it, looking to see what needs a citation and whether or not they did that effectively. And then what's going to happen is the papers are going to then rotate over to the next group, which will be the main idea locator. So in the main idea locator, that group then is looking at it, just again underlining the main point. So now that same paper gets rotated over. You see the conveyor belt model kind of happening. It gets rotated over to the completeness checker, and they're checking off to see if they all received, if all the questions were answered. And then that paper goes back to the student. I usually have students write like a little some kind of mark in the upper right hand corner, favorite number or something, so they can find their papers without having their names attached to it. When they get it back, now they've gotten feedback from 3 different groups. It might be individuals, or it could be partners working together on that feedback, and it's very specific. So when I do this process, my students really find that it works very well. And then as a peer reviewer, you also got to see 3 peer models, that you worked with, although you only looked at it through one lens, either the citation lens, the main idea lens, or the completeness checker. So I hope that makes sense. They're kind of rotating through, the paper moves from group to group, and then it ends up back with the person who created it, so that they have that specific feedback. Now, obviously, your role as a faculty member is to A, make sure they all know what they're doing in the beginning, so the training is important, and B, you want to be spot checking. So as they're working, you want to be walking around and supporting them if they have questions, and checking to see if they're following the task according, to the way that you outlined it to be. So great strategy of making peer feedback a much more effective process than just say, here, give some feedback to your peer. Is this, what do you think they can do to improve their paper? Because that's overwhelming and students don't know what to do with that. So another strategy you can use is asking students to either create a rubric or use a rubric that you've given to provide feedback. So let's say you're using a rubric for an assignment. You can have peers use that same rubric to provide some concrete feedback to their classmates as well. And you also might want to consider having a brief paper or a form that it can be completed by a peer. So in some of the research articles that you're reading about, you'll see that asking students to paraphrase, summarize main points, things of that nature. It's not you don't have to judge a classmate. In fact, judgments often are problematic when you're doing peer-to-peer evaluation. So instead of judging them, what you want to do is make it more concrete. So based on reading this, these are the 3 main points that I walked away with. And then you'll know whether, well, is that what you wanted them to walk away with, or are they missing the point? So you can come up with different solutions. You might want that to be, again, in the format of a form with questions and answers, or maybe a brief paper or something, kind of saying, well, here are the strengths, and here are some of the suggestions, based on how they answered those questions. So again, the faculty member still has a significant role. It's not it's not an easy process at all for the faculty member, because you do have to engage in the training. You do need to do those quality checks, and I really find that if you grade the feedback, if there's some layer of grading, then students are more likely to take this process much more seriously. So it can be challenging, but it is a great way to get peers involved, and it certainly can reduce your grading feedback time. If you had to do it all yourself, you may not be able to provide feedback in as timely of a manner. So I hope that helps you think about how you can do peer evaluation, and I'm sure the readings and all will also help you better understand this process.